Like it or not, the senior and elderly population is vulnerable to negligence committed by medical professionals, nursing home and assisted living facilities, pharmaceutical and medical device companies, insurance companies, and everyday individuals and businesses. The Injured Senior Podcast is here to help. Steve Heisler is the creator of the National Injured Senior Law Center and has been advocating for seniors' rights for over 20 years. You have questions, and Steve Heisler has answers. This is the Injured Senior Podcast.
Greetings, Injured Senior community, and welcome to the Injured Senior Podcast. I am Stephen H. Heisler, founder and CEO of the National Injured Senior Law Center, coming to you from the basement of my house in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland. You are dialed into the Injured Senior Podcast, where we educate and discuss issues of vital importance to our injured senior and elderly community, as well as to the children and loved ones of our injured senior and elderly community. We also educate the aging population on how not to become an injured senior or elder. I am your humble host, and I am awfully happy to be with you today. So I want to thank the National Injured Senior Law Center for their kind sponsorship of this podcast. There are 100 million or so people in the United States over the age of 50. The National Injured Senior Law Center are the legal advocates for the aging population in the United States. A program note. Next week, we are proud to have Father Tom Doyle on the podcast. Father Doyle will be discussing clergy sex abuse and how he had the courage to blow the whistle on the sexual predators in the Catholic Church back in the 1980s. And it's been over 40 years. So Father Tom Doyle will be with us to discuss clergy sex abuse. We are also happy to announce that Dr. Joseph Casciani, a clinical geropsychologist and founder of the Living to 100 Club, will be on the show to talk about his Living to 100 Club and about aging with a positive mindset, no matter how hard the journey. He has a national weekly radio show on aging and longevity, and we really can't wait for this episode. So that's coming up along with some other great guests and episodes. Now, before we get to today's guest, I want to give a special shout out to Rita Finley, who is the unofficial mayor of Dayton, Ohio, and a listener of the podcast. Thanks for giving me your thoughts, Rita, and thanks for being a part of our injured senior community. Okay, injured senior community. Today we have Dr. Sam Sugar on the show to talk about the risks, the truths, and the dangers of guardianships. Dr. Sugar is a medical doctor and a founder of the president of Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianships, AAAPG, an organization designed to expose the corruption of the nation's guardianship systems. Dr. Sugar received his medical degree from the Abraham Lincoln College of Medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He achieved certification as a specialist in internal medicine from the American Board of Internal Medicine and was distinguished as a fellow of the American College of Physicians. He has served as a director for managed care at Evanston Northwestern Healthcare and has taught at both Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine and the Chicago Medical School. In 2014, after experiencing the horrors of guardianship firsthand, Dr. Sugar created Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship. Dr. Sugar, thank you for appearing on the podcast today. How are you?
Just fine, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. So what was the horror of guardianship that you experienced firsthand?
Probably the first thing that we had any knowledge of experiencing that such a thing existed when this case that I'm forbidden to discuss, I have a court order that I'm not allowed to say anything about this particular case that involved a family member, so I won't. But in general, when we discovered that this guardianship process had been subverted to a racket, basically, a very profitable racket for the entire for-profit guardianship industry, which includes the court insiders, the judge, the lawyers, the guardians, and an army of people downstream who profit from it by virtue of straw man sales, underhanded kickbacks, and the like. It's a gigantic industry, and it's enormously profitable, and the people in it will do anything to keep it going.
So that was the driving force for you to create the Americans Against Abuse of Probate Guardianship. Is that correct?
Well, actually, it's an interesting little story, and that is in the midst of the early portion of this ordeal, my wife and I kind of came to the conclusion, well, we're just really unlucky. This probably only happened to us, and there are probably no other people in the world that could have the bad luck to run into a judge like that and lawyers like that and horrible people in this system. And I was invited out of the blue to attend a political breakfast for someone who was running for the school board where I lived. And it was a free breakfast, so I went. And while I was there, I raised my hand and I said, do you have a position on probate guardianship? Which in retrospect was a crazy question to ask. But he answered it as best he could. And then I was stopped afterwards by another woman who said, why did you ask about that? One thing led to another, and we discovered that the two of us were involved in that. And then 2 became 4, and 4 became 8, and now it's about 1,000 families, not individuals, families, who are on our website and mailing list and social media. And it's through association with all of the other victims around the country now, because we're national, that I put together the organization about 7 years ago. And we've done some good work over the years. And actually, the really incredible news is in the last week alone, and we're talking at the beginning of September, we just got 2 people, one in Ohio and one in Florida, out of abusive guardianships and out of the danger of being in a facility that has COVID in it. Being in a facility now, if you're an old, infirm person, your likelihood of dying in a facility is incredibly high. We were able to convince a couple of judges that they should let these poor people live out their days without the fear of being murdered by the virus. So that was nice.
Yeah, that's incredible. And congratulations on obviously some really good work that was done. So you mentioned Ohio, and I think he also said Florida. So this is not unique to just the retirement states of the country, such as Florida or Arizona, California, Vegas.
Well, it's certainly present in every state to a varying degree. And I will tell you, much to my surprise, over the years, I've learned that the absolute worst state in the country, which is saying a lot, is Michigan, of all places. Their system is absolutely breathtakingly corrupt, and everybody knows it, and nobody's willing to do anything about it. And over the years, our work has spawned an advocacy group in Michigan, which is really very well populated, very active, and getting great results, called The Voice, run by one of our advocates. And that's, of all the accomplishments that people say we've made, spawning new advocates, and maybe spawning is the wrong word, but creating and enabling new advocates all over the country is really the way we will ultimately be victorious in making the world aware of the deficiencies and corruption that we so easily see just by scratching the surface in crooked probate courts across the country. And the top 5 states are easy because we've sent out surveys, we have information and statistics and observational information, it's Michigan, Florida, California, Texas, and probably Colorado.
Wow. So let's delve into exactly what a guardianship is for our injured senior community. Obviously, I know that I had no awareness at all of abuse of probate guardianships until I watched The Guardian made by Billy Mintz. And Billy's been on the show. He was on a couple of weeks ago, but I had no idea what guardianship was. Can you tell our injured senior community a little bit about what a guardianship is?
Absolutely. And my hat's off to Billy also. His film really showed in stark detail a few stories of what this system can do. Guardianship is a legal process by which a court can remove the rights of someone who hasn't broken the law or done anything wrong. That someone can be alleged, usually by a lawyer, to be in need of protection from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Usually the lawyer brings an allegation, an unsubstantiated, unverified, unsworn, just one lawyer talking, saying, quote, "Your Honor, there's someone in our community in your jurisdiction who may be being abused, neglected, or exploited, period." That's the magic sentence. At that point, the judge has the ability and the initiative to appoint what's called a substitute decision maker. That is an individual who ultimately will be given what's called letters of guardianship, at which point that a guardian has wards, and a ward needs a guardian. So that's what you call a person who's in this situation, either an allegedly incapacitated ward, and we'll go into the real question of what incapacity means, and a ward needs a guardian. The guardian then owns that person. And I want to say that again for emphasis. A ward is the property of his or her guardian, a piece of chattel. And the guardian can do pretty much whatever they want to do as long as they have a court order with that person, that's a guardian of the person, or with their money, that's a guardian of the state, or both if that's a plenary guardian. In some places like California, they make distinctions with words, guardian, conservator, etc. But it's all the same thing. It's a substitute decision maker, and the individual in question overnight is relieved of all his assets, all his personal possessions, his right to vote, right to marry, right to hire a lawyer, right to decide where he lives or where he gets his medical care. And I say the right of him. It's usually not a him. It's usually a lady who is a survivor from her husband's death. And that person is then at the mercy of this guardian who typically the majority of guardianships are okay, because the majority of guardianships are family guardianships.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah. I mean, so there's definitely a distinction.
Yeah, there's a huge distinction between family and professional. And family guardianships do constitute the great majority of guardianships in the country. And in the last 30 years or so, there has arisen an entire group, a class of what's called professional for-profit guardians. And for example, in Florida, in the late 80s and early 90s, there were about 24 of those kind of people, 24 to 30, depends how you count them. But today there are over 600. And people ask me, why are there so many professional guardians? And this is in Florida I'm talking about now. In the country, nobody knows. Yeah. But the answer is, that's like Willie Sutton said, that's where the money is. Not only do we not know how many professional guardians there are in the United States, We don't even know how many guardianships there are in the United States. The best guess by the GAO is somewhere between 1.5 million and 4 billion. In Florida, where the numbers have been provided to us by one of the premier clerks of court, who actually surveyed all 57 clerks of court in Florida, there are somewhere between 50 and 65,000 active guardianships today in Florida, and they're being created at a rate of between 7,000 and 8,000 new ones a year.
And I read your book, which was an excellent book, by the way. I'm going to get into that a little bit later on. But are these 55, 60,000 guardianships in Florida? Are you talking about all are involving for-profit guardians or just?
No, I wish I could give you those numbers, but because court records for guardianships are considered mental health issues, the court records are typically sequestered, meaning that people like us can't research these numbers, although they do exist. The Department of Elderly Affairs knows all this information, but is constitutionally forbidden to share it. So this is a system and a business that generates many billions of dollars a year for its perpetrators, if you want to use that clause. And if you have the ability to be recognized by the court as a professional guardian, and people ask, well, what does it take? That's a great job. What do I need to do? I mean, do I have to have a graduate degree? Do I need certification? Well, the answer is no. Here are the requirements, generally speaking, to be a guardian in Florida. Ready?
Yep.
Got to be 18. You got to get out. You have to have passed high school. A GED is good enough. You can't have had a conviction for a criminal offense, for a felony. Parking tickets are okay. And you have to complete a course that's supposed to be 40 hours long, but can be completed in a weekend at a junior college if you pay a few bucks. Then all you have to do is submit your application and not lie about previous bankruptcies, which we've seen done repeatedly. And boom, you are a professional, you are a guardian. In order to become a professional guardian and recognized as such, you have to have been appointed at least 3 wards.
So, it kind of sounds like almost like a mail order type certification. But once someone gets certified, what is the level of regulation or oversight by the state?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it. When our organization was in its early stages, there were a dozen of us or so who recognized that at least part of the problem was due to an abject failure of monitoring and supervision of not only guardianships, not only the lawyers, but the judges. And even though Florida statute and statutes in every state really provide a mechanism for supposedly oversight over the courts and these guardianships, we realized that the laws were insufficient, and we went down to our state capital, Tallahassee, and we were successful 2 years in a row to change the statute 744, to include more monitoring, oversight, and supervision, and to create a new agency called the Office of Public and Professional Guardians, the OPPG. And we were, those pieces of legislation were accepted unanimously ultimately. There was applause in the chamber of the combined legislature. And if you ask me now, 5 years or 4 years later, what difference they've made, the answer is 0. Because this isn't about following the law. And in fact, it's about not following the law. It's about the fact that our legal system is a 2-track system. One is the courts that do civil and criminal law, which have juries and rules of procedure, rules of evidence, and a very strict conduct code that, if you don't follow it, ruins your case. But we have a second track called equity court. And equity courts are comprised of divorce, family, used to be bankruptcy, but not anymore, and probate. These courts are fiefdoms, as was stated quite clearly in federal Senate testimony by Richard Blumenthal, Senator Blumenthal, who said, quote, "I'm familiar with these situations. Every judge has his own little fiefdom, and everybody around him gets filthy rich," unquote. And that is in Susan Collins' committee, the Senate Special Select Committee on Aging, a year or two ago. In the equity system, everything that happens is the result of the judge and his solitary opinion. In other words, he will absolutely forbid juries, although they could be impaneled. They never are. Rules of evidence don't apply, interestingly, and due process doesn't apply. It's all about what a judge thinks or feels or believes at that moment in time. And because of that, as I call it, a deficiency in the system, there's really no oversight, there's no monitoring, and these judges, in addition, are fully cloaked with judicial immunity, so you can't sue them. You really can't sue the lawyers of the guardian because they have quasi-judicial immunity. So if you don't like what's going on in that court, you're kind of screwed. Your only option is to do an appeal to a district court of appeal, where the likelihood of the district court of appeal even accepting your argument, even accepting the case, is less than 50-50, because another judge has already ruled against you. And the odds of winning in an appeal are infinitesimal. So once you get involved in this process, you are at the mercy of one individual and the people around him who he sees every day, who he sees socially, who he works with. And whether it's intentional or not, the judge has a bias in favor of those people. I think that's just undeniably true and can be scientifically proven.
Well, that was evident on the Guardians when Jared Schaefer didn't ask, demanded that the judge close the court and have everybody empty out of the courtroom, because one of the wards, or the awards attorney, was about to talk about some of the court's dirty linen, and the judge is almost as if, he, of course, Mr. Schaefer, and he emptied out the court. So I also wanted to just let our listeners know that, because some of our listeners might not know exactly what, when you say, well, I'm entitled to due process, one of the biggest things about due process is notice. And also in the Guardians, they just showed up, the Guardian, or one of the Guardian's stooges, ends up at your, knocks on your door and says, "You need to come with me. Just come right now." I mean, it's almost like the Gestapo. You don't know who they are, and they tell you just to come with me and don't ask any questions. So yeah, the due process rights, I think, is the most egregious of what is being denied to the elderly individuals who unfortunately become wards of these people.
Right. And that's really the tip of the iceberg of the due process scam. Some of this was shown in Billy Mintz's movie, but changing the postmark dates on notice so that an individual isn't notified of a hearing until after it's happened, intentionally putting the wrong address on notice for hearings, claiming that, and this happened in our case too, claiming that it was impossible to determine the address of an interested party when that interested party has listings in the phone book, is on Google, and is actually very well known on social media.
Yeah.
So the tricks of the trade, in fact, I just wrote about this on our website, the tricks, which is www.AAAPG.net. The tricks of the trade are incredible because these people, these attorneys primarily, and the guardians that they represent who are paid, both the guardian and attorney are paid from the assets of the estate. So if you buck up against the system, the lawyers who are fighting you are being paid with your inheritance. It's an incredibly perverse system. Nobody seems to care. And of course, because these legal fees accumulate very quickly and guardian fees, they can wipe out an estate in no time. And because there really is no restriction on how many hours a lawyer can bill, what his rates might or might not be. And interestingly, most of the lawyers who are on the other side of this are men. A lot of the women who defend us, others, are women, interestingly. And in terms of approving the fees, the judges in these hot spots like Palm Beach, Florida, like Orlando, like Tampa, like Harris County in Texas, Oakland County, Michigan, and a bunch of other Michigans ones, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They approve these fees rubber stamp. And there's no limit on them. So it's easy to understand why one of the first cases I got involved in was the guardianship of a very wealthy builder from New York whose estate was worth $100 million. And within 3 months, $9 million of legal fees. I advised that his wife just give up, walk away, and save herself. In the end, they wound up pilfering $15 to $20 million.
That is outrageous. I mean, it's just hard to fathom. I really can't.
Right, and that's why it's so hard to believe. When we first went down to our state capitol to push for new legislation, I remember so clearly some staffers in the offices of one of these let's say, highly influenced lawyer legislators actually ridiculed us. Look at those crybabies. They want mommy and daddy's money right now. I'll never forget that. It infuriated me. They sing a different tune now because many of them have been fired. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is that with the book and the social media and the website and everything, we are getting the word out. This is unfortunately an intergenerational struggle and will last long past my lifetime. But it has to be fought because you're looking at me on video right now. I eat no spring chicken. And this could happen to me or you at a moment's notice if you have the predisposing factors. And this is what your listeners need to hear. If you are in a family that's fighting over money, over who should control grandma or grandpa or mom or dad, or if you have a sick individual and the burden of care has been dumped on one person, this is an open door to litigation in probate, and it will consume you for years. It will destroy your family. It will make you a pauper. And in some terribly unfortunate situations, can lead to alcoholism, drug addiction, and rarely suicide. It is a curse. It is an embarrassment to our legal system. And anything you can do to avoid probate court, you should do.
All right. So I guess that leads me into my next question. So can you give some ways that individuals can prevent becoming, a ward of a guardian, and also the families, what they can do to prevent a guardianship?
Sure. And that's the point of all of this, I'm sure. In the first place, make sure you have valid and recent advance directives. Advance directives are two types of documents. One is a durable power of attorney for your financial matters, and the other one is a healthcare power of attorney to determine who you want to make medical decisions for you at a time where you can't. Those have to be perfect. And most importantly, in your durable power of attorney, there must be a clause that says something like, I specifically prohibit any court or any other governmental entity from appointing for me any professional guardian at any time for any reason in perpetuity. Because if you don't have that in your advance directives, I've seen one case where a judge has said, I'm looking at these advance directives, and it doesn't say anything about I shouldn't appoint a guardian, so I will. And you need to make sure that those advance directives are easily available and retrievable by people you trust. You can't hide them in a safe, because when you need them, they won't be able to be found. That's the first thing. The second thing is the hard part: solve your family disputes. I cannot tell you how important that is. If you got family members, even a distant aunt or uncle or cousin or niece or nephew, they can start this process, even if they haven't seen you for 10 years. If they're what's called interested parties, heal your wounds, heal your divisions, and lessen the likelihood that somebody's going to go after you when you're at your weakest.
So is that the more prevalent types of ways that people ultimately become a victim of guardianship, as opposed to an older, aging, or elderly individual who is walking around the parking lot of a Walmart and can't seem to find their car? What is really the reality of how these are actually becoming guardianships?
The sad reality, the really sad reality that strikes me is that the very institutions and people that are supposed to be assisting those who are in need possibly are where the worst guardianship abuses take place. For example, hospitals. A large number of hospitalized individuals who maybe broke their hip, had a heart attack, had a stroke, need dialysis, are visited by friendly social workers. Friendly social workers or other hospital staff who are concerned, gosh, this person hasn't had a visitor in a day or two. They must be all alone. They must need help. And I must need the bounty that I'll collect by reporting it to a lawyer. That happens a lot. These guardians hang out and can be found in senior centers, in doctor's offices, in clinics, in daycare centers, in dialysis centers. Anywhere where an elderly, frail person can be found, you will find individuals complicit in this corruption, including doctors, nurses, social workers, ER technicians, therapists, because, disgustingly, there are bounties for referring them.
So are they solicited by these professional guardians?
I can't prove that, but I strongly suspect it.
Okay.
Not just the guardians, but their attorneys as well.
Well, right. And I guess one thing our injured senior community, I think, is probably going to cause them great anxiety is, their personal attorneys, the ones that are creating their estates or their trust or their wills, or just the family attorney. If they go and they kind of air out their grievances with other family members, or are those family lawyers also part of this whole scheme?
No. Actually, one has to understand who the lawyers in probate really are. And there are two distinct classes of estate attorneys and probate attorneys. The first is your garden variety estate attorney, whose primary job is to create documents that can be relied upon in court and that clearly state the wishes of their client. But there's a second variety of lawyers that are called litigators. They're the ones who challenge those documents in court. They're the ones who have this ability to bill unlimited hours. I mean, look, it's not cheap to make an estate plan. It costs. I just did mine last year. It cost me a few $1,000s. I have it right in my library shelf right there. And that's important. It's got to be available, and your kids need to know about it, and your relatives and everything. They need to know where to find it in case it needs to be enforced. But the litigators are the ones who know all the weaknesses of the documents that have been created. They know how to challenge them, and they know the judge that they're in front of, who they see every single day, is sensitive about this aspect or another aspect of approving advance directives. So one of the tricks is to present, if they ever do present the advance directives, because they can be hidden from the judge too, to say, Your Honor, this advance directive is 15 years old. How do we know today that this person whom I am saying is incapacitated today wasn't incapacitated then? What proof is there that they were capacitated then? And of course, there isn't any. So one of the things that I started doing years ago was providing patients certificates of capacity to clarify that on a given date, an individual, and this was for people of great means, great wealth, at least on the date certain, they were fully capacitated. So that little trick of the trade wouldn't apply to them. But I am telling you, I have seen and heard of tricks that would make your head spin. These lawyers are very bright. They know every aspect of the law and how to manipulate it. So you're really at a disadvantage. And your lawyer, by the way, you would ask this, if your lawyer is an estate lawyer who just makes documents and he attempts to represent you in one of these probate hotspot courts, he'll get chewed up alive because he has no experience in litigation.
Right. Should our listenership be concerned that their family attorneys who are privy to some of the problems of mom or dad or family feuding or whatever, should they be concerned that the family attorney would be the one to turn them into the guardianship professional guardian, or is that something that you see? Or
it's not common, but it's a real concept that could turn out to be a problem, which is why I'll just use myself as an example. I researched estate attorneys and specifically did not go to our family attorney, specifically because I didn't want anybody but that one lawyer knowing what my issues were. And if they ever came up, I would know exactly where it came from.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a concern among many, many, many concerns. For example, for a husband and wife team, did your listeners know that your marriage can be annulled by a judge in an estate contest? Did you know that a judge can divorce you during a proceeding to take away your right to inherit from a spouse? A judge has the power of God in his courtroom. And you just don't want to wind up in any of those courts. Because even under the best of circumstances, these contested guardianships take years, in some cases decades, and they will make you penniless. It will drain every cent you have trying to defend yourself. And I'm sad to say that in some cases, I've counseled patients to just get patients. I've counseled people.
Doctor.
I got my doctor hat on.
Get your doctor hat on.
I've counseled people to give up.
So can you give our listenership, our injured senior community, and you kind of went into it a little bit ago, just some action steps? So if they have some real concern that there could be a family member, a mom or a dad that's going to come under guardianship, or if they're actually under guardianship, what are some action steps they can take to try to do everything in their power to alleviate the problem?
Okay, the first one is the hardest one, try to mend fences. The second one is the advance directives, and I'll be even more specific. In your advance directives, you will be asked to name an individual who you would take as a preference to represent your interest as a substitute decision maker should the condition arise. And my strong advice is to name at least 6 people, starting with the one you want the most, going down and ending with one that may not be your first choice, but would be acceptable. The reason for this is, and I'm all too familiar with this, it's a recurrent problem where the judge says, well, let's see, Mrs. Jones, you've named your nephew Charles to be your guardian should it come arise. Well, I've looked into Charles, and he's got a lot of parking tickets. He's probably a scofflaw, and he's not appropriate. Well, if he's the only person you named, you're screwed. So if you name Charles and Frank and Tom and John and Sean, he's not going to be able to disallow all of them.
Right.
Well, at least not easily.
Yeah.
So that's the second thing. Name a number of people. Number 3, videotape what you want to say. Make a videotape record of your wants and desires when you become in need of assistance, and make multiple copies, make sure that you distribute them to everybody who might need them or want them. This is where show everybody, this is what I want. I'm of good health today, and should something happen to me, I want 1, 2, 3, 4, and be very specific. It doesn't matter how long it takes. The longer the video, the better. And ideally, it should be done in front of a notary public.
Right. To document that it's not anybody else that's doing this. It's not right. So, Doctor, as we're winding down, the show has just flown by. Tell our injured senior community a little bit about your book, Guardianships in the Elderly, The Perfect Crime. It came out a couple of years ago. I'm about halfway through it, and it is absolutely just, so revealing, and really, it's really very, very sad, some of the things that I'm learning through this book, but it's extremely informative, and I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about it.
The book came about because I was approached by a victim in New York who had a relative who was going through this, and it turns out that the person who approached me was a publisher. And he took me to lunch and said, I've been reading the stuff on your website, AAAPG.net. I've been looking at your Facebook page and your Twitter account and all of your social media, and I think you must write a book. He says, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, and I will publish that book for you, and you will do it. He didn't give me a choice. It took me a long time because it's my first non-medical book. But I tried in the book to take a God's eye view of the process and describe for the naive reader what actually transpires from the beginning to the end of this process, the dozens and dozens and dozens of people and officers and agencies and officials and you name it, just a boatload of people that you're suddenly forced to deal with. People you've never met before who don't know anything about you and vice versa, and have the power over you to make you poor, to make you crazy with subpoenas and sanctions and lawsuits and depositions and appearances. You need to understand the severity of what can happen in these things to give you the energy to do everything you can possibly do to avoid it, because these probate laws were established to create an administrative process to handle the affairs of dead people. Probate can only deal with dead people. These hearings, when they aren't contested, take a half hour and you're done. When you have a contested guardianship, you're talking about countless hearings, enormous legal fees, enormous stress that should be avoided at any and every cost. And unfortunately, even under the best of circumstances, with an honest judge and lawyers who aren't that greedy, and guardians who mean well, the process is still extremely difficult. I wanted to let people know how difficult it is to become a family guardian. And we don't talk enough about family guardian. They deserve our highest praise and our highest respect, because this is usually a family member who's taking care of a loved one who doesn't get paid, who spends an enormous amount of time out of love, and they are the first ones attacked in these processes. It's so unfair. So I wanted to write a book that's a primer for the uninitiated, to let them know how the system really works, how it starts, because they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and how it ends. And in the back of the book, we have a glossary and a resources section, which gives you the names, and there are lots of them, of organizations and agencies where you can turn to for help.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and I've learned a lot. So hopefully the book will have a real positive impact.
Yeah, and it's available at most booksellers, and it's on Amazon, and it's not expensive. It's intentionally inexpensive so that anyone can afford it. And to anyone who's past the age of 60 or 65, you've got to know about this. It's maybe one of the most important things that will ever happen to you, God forbid. And whether it does or doesn't, you need to know that it might.
You know, to think that this is happening in the quote unquote freest society in the world is just beyond me. So if someone wants to contact you or AAAPG regarding, a loved one or themselves facing a possible guardianship, how do they get in touch with you, doctor?
Well, the easiest way is email, and my email is very easy. It's Dr. Sam, DRSAM, at AAAPG.net. And that's the best way to get a hold of me, because I really pay attention to email.
Okay, and I can attest that you responded to my email within, I think it was like within 12 hours. I mean, I was like, wow, that's pretty good. And what about if our listeners want to find you on social media? What platforms are you on, doctor?
The most relevant one is Facebook. And we have our own Facebook page, Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, on Facebook. And I'm pretty responsive there too. People send me things on Messenger, Twitter less so, and et cetera, et cetera. The sad news is about that, I have found that social media has great promise, but very little results.
Yeah. And if they want to go to the website again, it's AAAPG.net, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Dr. Sugar, thank you so much for taking some time out to let us know about this epidemic. And we want to have you back again, so maybe you can tell some stories about some abusive probate guardianships and some lessons learned and so on. But we definitely want to have you back again.
Well, thank you. And let me send my greetings and best wishes to your audience of injured seniors. Life gets better all the time, and I can attest to that. Hang it in there, and usually things work out.
Thank you, doctor. Injured senior community, if you have any questions about a potential case you believe you have, please feel free to contact me at the National Injured Senior Law Center at steve@injuredseniorhotline.com. Also, if you'd like to audition to be a guest on the Injured Senior podcast, such as telling your particular story about any type of situation where you've been injured, we have an extensive community, extensive support group. And again, just email me at steve@injuredseniorhotline.com. Like the content that was discussed today, and we had a lot of real good content coming from Dr. Sugar. Just head on over to our show notes where you'll find a summary of today's show and any important links we mentioned in this episode. And if you like what you hear, feel free to subscribe to the podcast. You can go to any of your favorite platforms. We're on Apple, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. We're on all the platforms. So please feel free to subscribe. And if you would, rate and review us. Thanks again for listening to today's show. Be sure to tune in to next week's show. We have Dr. Father Tom Doyle coming on to talk about clergy sex abuse. And we will talk to you next week. Stay safe and be good, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Injured Senior Podcast with Steve H. Heisler. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate, subscribe, review, and share on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more or to get help anytime, go to injuredseniorhotline.com or call 855-622-6530. We'll see you next time.